Yo, 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 what is happening, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Grow CFO Podcast, where, as you know, we're diving deep into conversations about scaling a DTC brand, but we're talking about doing it with a profit-focused mindset because businesses exist to turn a profit. I'm your host, Jon Blair, founder of Grow CFO. We're the go-to outsourced finance and accounting firm for 8- and 9-figure DTC brands. And today, I'm here with my buddy, Nate Littlewood, founder and fractional CFO at Future Ready. Nate, what's happening, man?
Not much, John. Great to be here and looking forward to chatting with you.
Yeah, so some of you may be wondering, like, what are you, John, another fractional CFO on the show? Like, what, you're bringing your competition on? But Nate's not just any fractional CFO. He's a friend of ours, and he's also, I would consider, to be a partner firm. He is a very trusted source that we sometimes hand off brands that are just not a good fit for Free to Grow for one reason or another. And so we're always happy to be chatting with Nate. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to do something called Ecom War Stories.
It sounds like it could get scary.
Yeah, Nate and I were having a conversation, like, I don't know what, maybe a month or so ago, and we got talking just briefly about some of the COVID war stories that he and I had both been through on the brand side. And Nate's like, dude, this is a podcast episode, right? Yeah. And I'm like, yeah, this definitely is. And so I actually have no agenda except for, first, to start with Nate's background and journey to starting Future Ready, and then we're gonna chat war stories, man. So before we dive into the war stories, I give everyone a background, your background and your journey to starting Future Ready. I think just so everyone knows, Nate and I, from my perspective, hit it off because Nate is an operator like I am, comes from the brand side of the world, kind of turned fractional CFO and many other things. He doesn't just do that, right? It's one of many things that he does. But walk us through your journey, man. I think you have a really cool story.
Yeah, for sure. So I studied engineering in my undergrad, but ended up spending about the first half of my career working on Wall Street at an investment bank. So I was a sell-side equity research analyst, which, when you're first getting started, basically means that you're eating financial models for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So there was a day where I was spending 14 to 16 hours a day pumping out huge valuation models. I think the biggest model I ever produced was about 30,000 rows, and
oh man,
yeah, they got pretty big. But basically, the role of that job or that industry is to try to forecast the future with financial models, and then we sold our ideas and theses and perspective on where these companies were going to institutional investors, right? So 401, the people who are managing your 401k essentially. I started off doing that in Australia, as you can probably tell from the accent. But then spent a couple of years in Toronto and moved down to New York in 2012, and was most recently running the metals and mining team for an investment bank called Credit Suisse out in New York. From there, I left that industry after a few years working in New York, went back to school, did an MBA, which I kind of used as my opportunity to, I guess, reinvent myself as an entrepreneur. Where and when I grew up, entrepreneurship wasn't really a thing, right? Like, the educational system that I grew up in was all about training people how to be a cog in a bigger wheel. And career and work, everyone thought it was about climbing ladders and getting, fancy titles. So it wasn't really until I'd spent a couple of years in New York that I'd had my eyes opened up to the whole world of entrepreneurship. And I looked at it and thought, you know what, like, this involves creativity. This involves building things. This involves, solving problems. Like, I should have been doing this all along. That's all stuff that I love. So I was like, all right, well, I'm going to go figure out entrepreneurship. So I used my time at business school to, take a pretty big career pivot, launched my own company in 2017, which we bootstrapped from a fairly small Kickstarter campaign through to a 7-figure brand. learned so much about supply chain operations and business through COVID, more than an MBA could ever teach you.
Yep.
But anyway, look, how I got to what I'm doing today, a year or two ago, I started working with an accelerator program called Food Future Co. Initially, honestly, for somewhat selfish reasons, I was just wanting to explore my next, career steps and figure out where I was going to go. But what I discovered through this process is that a few things. Firstly, I really, really enjoy working with, mentoring, and coaching other entrepreneurs. Secondly, I saw time and time again how big an impediment a lack of financial knowledge and understanding was to these early stage entrepreneurs. So, you're in an accelerator program, you're surrounded by people who are wanting to help these, startup founders, and I was one of these mentors, right? But I found myself kind of talking about these problems and issues, whether it be marketing, operations, or whatever. And I didn't know whether I should be brainstorming solutions that cost $1,000, $10,000, or $100,000 because I had no freaking clue what these companies' financials look like. And whenever I asked these founders, like, what's going on with your numbers? Like, what can you afford? What does your cash flow look like? I would just get, blank faces. And I thought, this isn't right. Like, you've got people here who are trying to build something. They've, clearly know the problem, the product, and the people that they're solving it to. But their lack of financial acumen is basically, it's a roadblock here, and they're not getting the help they need because they cannot talk and they do not understand the language of finance. So that was kind of my journey into becoming a fractional CFO. I kind of looked at all this and thought, you know what? I understand finance, I understand numbers, I understand the entrepreneur's journey. And when I put all those pieces together, I was like, I don't know, maybe I should have a go at this. So that's how I got here.
I love it, man. Yeah. We have some similarity in our background because I started in the accounting and finance world, but always for early stage brands. And most recently, before starting Free to Grow CFO, was on the founding team of Guardian Bikes, which was an Ecom brand that scaled up from 0 to 8 figures in just a few short years. But by virtue of being an operator, right, just like yourself, and on the founding team of a brand, we start with nothing. We all wore a bunch of hats, right? And like, yeah, I was on paper, I was the CFO and the COO. But in reality, I did all kinds of stuff because at the beginning there was just 3 of us, right? And
Yeah.
we weren't fully bootstrapped. We raised a little bit of money, but we were always undercapitalized. We never did these big fancy raises, like
Yeah.
consumer goods. And look, this was like 2016, 2017. So similar to you, that's when Guardian Bikes launched in 2016. There weren't these big, crazy, fancy valuations for Ecom brands back then, right? I mean, and still today after the bubble burst, there isn't. There was for a period of time, which we'll probably get to some of that potentially when we talk about our war stories. But like we had to fight for every dollar that we raised. So we had to be very frugal with every dollar that we had in the bank account. And because of that, we had to do a bunch of stuff ourselves, man. I mean, and in fact, I think that's probably a good segue into like one of the first war stories I want to tell, which is like, so here's the thing. At Guardian Bikes, we built what we branded as, and what truly is, the safest kids bike. Shipped direct to your door. We had a patent, we still have a patent to this day, on a brake that prevents you from flipping over the handlebars. And when we first brought Guardian to market, this was actually, this is part of the war story. We were actually a brake company first. The business started in 2009. And what the business model we had in mind was like, there are tens of millions of bikes that are sold every year in the US. And this brake could be retrofitted on any existing V-brake system, which is most bikes that are sold in the country use V-brakes, for only about $1 upcharge, right? And so what our thinking is that we could get this on tens of millions of bikes and become like the new standard for braking, not for enthusiasts, but for the mass market, like the common, just like kind of like joy rider, the typical person, which is where most of the volume gets sold. And once we become the staple, because there's no competition, because of our patents, like we're going to totally crush it. Well, here's what we found out. This was like kind of crazy. We started getting onto Schwinn and Huffy models, and we had a decent amount of volume, like tens of thousands of units. But when you're selling a brake for $1 or $2, 10,000 units, 20,000 units,
you're gonna do some volume.
That's not a yeah, right. And we're
Yeah.
raising money at like a 7-figure valuation, right? So we need to do a lot better than that, right? And so product managers, which were the guys and gals who are designing the bikes, they loved it because there's nothing innovative in bikes. Yeah, there are little micro innovations, but there's no mass innovations in bikes for a really long time. And so here they go going like, oh my gosh, this is unique. And so they're like pushing on leadership, like we need to acquire this company because we need to own Sure Stop brakes. If Schwinn owns it and Huffy doesn't, like there's finally the differentiation in this commoditized market that's a race to the bottom.
Yeah.
Well, here's where the war story comes into play. We've got all these product managers super stoked. We feel like we're getting product market fit because we're getting placed on certain models. But again, at volume's so low it's not a viable business. Well, what ends up happening is the buyer at Walmart. Here's the crazy thing. We learned Walmart sells like 75% of the mass market bike volume in the country. So what does that mean? They've got all the pricing. They've got all the power, right, in the marketplace when it comes to mass market bikes. The bike buyer at Walmart holds so much power against the mass market brands. And he has negotiated them all to like no margin. Right. And so we met with him directly and he said, I want Sure Stop on every single bike in Walmart, but I'm not paying a penny extra for it. Work it out with the brands of how they're going to pay $1 more. And what happened is Schwinn and Huffy were freaking out because they don't have $1 in their BOM. I know that sounds crazy, but their average price point at Walmart is like less than $100. And so and they're already operating on these razor thin margins because Walmart is just basically like literally Huffy told us like they have lost hundreds of thousands of units in shelf space over 5 cents. That's how commoditized and crazy it is. So when you come and say, I'm going to sell my brake for $1 more and there's no one else you can buy it from, right? They got completely freaked out and we basically got blocked from the market and we got forced to start Guardian bikes just to keep the business going. And what we realized was here, besides the whole Walmart incentive issue, right, you just can't tell the story in a Walmart or a Target aisle of why a Sure Stop brake matters. Why does it matter? Why is it better? Why is it worth more money? You can't tell that in a retail aisle, right? If you've ever been to a Walmart bike aisle, there's just freaking bikes laying everywhere. Kids are basically just going like, I like the color of that one, right? Or I like the basket or the bell. And so we realized we had to start an Ecom brand to tell the story direct to consumer, right? And that was the birth. We basically birthed Guardian Bikes 7 years into the company's history, pivoting from being a brake company because we were caught in this war between Walmart and the bike brands, and we were in the middle, and we were going to cost the bike brands $1 more, and they're like, we don't have $1 more. And that's actually like that's actually the birth of Guardian Bikes. So that's my first war story.
So you had to go from a product that cost $1 up to a product that cost tens or hundreds of dollars?
Hundreds of dollars because we're a premium bike, yeah.
Okay, just to be able to get it into the consumer's hands. Yeah,
Totally. Well, and really to build a value prop that like really if you have a patent on something, it doesn't matter unless you can extract the value out of that patent, in my opinion, right? Like you have to be able to extract the value out of it. And in our case, it's like, how do you charge more? How do you charge more for a bike? We wholeheartedly believe we could charge more for a bike if it was truly safer, because so many bikes on the marketplace, the average kid's bike is like $69 and it's a piece of crap and it's very unsafe. And so we knew that we could sell bikes for more, but you can't tell that story in brick and mortar retail in the mass market. You have to tell it in another channel, and we figured out how to tell it direct to consumer.
Nice. And how did all this pan out for you during COVID?
Okay, so I'm gonna tell a COVID war story here, and then I'm going to ask you for your first war story after that.
All
So,
right.
COVID, I'll give the high level war story, and then after you go, I've got a couple like more kind of micro war stories. But basically, as everyone knows, bikes, right? Bikes were one of those outdoor products that went insane during COVID. There was an overall like Ecom demand, we'll call it a generalized Ecom demand bump from COVID, but then there were these like focused demand bumps within product categories, and bikes was one of those. Kids were at home from school, super bored. Everyone was starting to do things outdoors because everything else was shut down. Outdoors is the only thing you could do. So people bought up bikes, not just e-com, even brick and mortar retail, like independent bike shops all sold out of bikes. It was crazy, dude. I will never forget this. So we were coming off of 2019. We missed a bunch of our sales goals, and we were like talking about straight up laying people off. Like, it was not a good conversation that we were having. And the company was small at that time. There was only maybe 6 or 7 of us. Maybe there was 8. But I think there was only like 4 or 5 that were full-time. Other people were like part-time and contractors. We totally missed our sales goals. We were talking about letting all these people go. And no joke, and we're like way behind our forecast in January 2020 and February 2020. And then March 2020, our sales just literally overnight, I'm not kidding, I remember looking at the graph in Shopify, just like took off. We sold out of all of our inventory in about like 25 days.
Yeah.
It was gone. We're calling the factory, and we're like, where are those next POs? And in bike lead times are really long. That's how the whole supply chain works. Like at that time, lead times were 90 days. Within 30 days after that March sales spike, factory started telling us like 6 months to get a bike. And we're like, 6 months? Like, and then like 07, 08, 12 months. And by the end of it all, like at the height of the supply chain getting really jacked, there's 12-month lead times in the middle of like trying to get the factory to ship orders that we had already placed on PO coming out of 2019. That was basically like what we had available to us. And luckily for us, we got lucky. So there's another crazy thing that happened in bikes before all of this. The Trump tariffs, right? The Trump tariffs slapped 25 to 36% tariffs on goods coming in from China. And for bikes, it was 36%. Prior to the Trump tariffs, they were 11. So think about your BOM costs, your landed costs, going from an 11% tariff product, which we were paying like, hundreds of dollars for a bike because it's a premium bike, going from 11 to 36, right? And so all of these bike brands are like flooding Southeast Asia. But this was before COVID. This was like, would have been, a lot of this was happening in 2017, 2018. So people are moving to Vietnam, Cambodia. We're doing all the research, and like once you add on like the additional freight costs and the lead times were longer, because here was the BS. People don't know this. All those factories in Cambodia and like Vietnam, who are they owned by? Chinese factories. So they're literally shipping what's called CKD, like components, to those Southeast Asia countries, assembling the bike, and then the origin is that country. So the lead time of that additional like move from China to those countries, you had to factor into the already long lead time. So we looked at it and we said, not worth it. It was going to save us a little bit of money, but it wasn't going to save us enough money. So we decided to stay in China. We ended up totally crushing a bunch of our competitors during COVID because we stayed with this little factory in China while these other brands were in the middle of moving to, or had just recently moved to, these underdeveloped countries that got decimated in COVID way more than China did. And so we already had this relationship, and we weren't a small fish in like a big pond. Like if we had been working with a bigger factory, we were that factory's biggest customer. And so we actually got way more bikes out of them than a lot of the other brands did. And so that just was luck, man. I mean, that was straight up luck. And because of that, we fared really, really well in 2020. Nice. It was crazy.
Nice. Wow. Yeah. I guess you got really lucky in a lot of ways there.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so what is your first ecom and possibly COVID war story that you?
Okay, so my first COVID/ecom war story would be about the lead into COVID. You mentioned bikes selling like hotcakes. The other thing was gardening products because everyone was at home, freaking out about supermarket shelves being empty and looking for hobbies. And everyone was like,
Oh
oh,
yeah.
I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to grow my own food in the backyard, that hobby that I've always wanted to do. And it helped that the beginning of COVID kind of coincided with spring, which is, already a busy time for gardening. So anyway, the company that I was working on, Urban Leaf, and Urban Leaf basically focuses on gardening for edible plants and mushrooms and this sort of thing for city dwellers, right? And we are and were a fairly mission-oriented company, and because of that, we thought we were pretty clever in terms of figuring out how to do most things domestically. So we thought, all right, we need to be putting our money where our mouth is. We need to be supporting, local manufacture. And we had a fairly domestic supply chain, like 95% of our products were being sourced or manufactured, pretty locally. There were, however, a couple of components for these gardening kits. And when I say gardening kits, think, a microgreens kit that has some trays, grow mat, seeds, box, other bits and pieces. Or we had a little herb gardening kit with like a planter box and some pots in it and soil and so forth. So they're not like super complicated products, but there's one or two components, often the containers, where sourcing them domestically would have cost us like 3 or 4 times as much. And we're an Amazon first business model, and we're kind of looking at the marketplace, looking at the margins, and we thought to ourselves, we just cannot get this math to work if we are buying all of these components domestically. So we kind of gave in and said, look, all right, let's go to China. We got them in, a fraction of the price compared to what we could have got them in the US. Anyway, then COVID hits. Things go freaking bananas. Our revenue grew at 400% year on year in 2020. It was absolutely insane. We were putting prices up left, right, and center just to slow down the sales, but
same
stuff was still selling out. So anyway, I guess it would have been Q2 2020. We're looking at all of this inventory flying off the shelf, and we start picking up the phone to our manufacturers and suppliers and going, "Can we order more? Can we order more?" And we, had no idea what was going to go on with COVID. But one of the good and bad things about entrepreneurs is that they tend to be very optimistic people, sometimes, to a flaw. And we were kind of redoing all of our demand models and had what I, now recognize as stupidly optimistic forecasts. And so we were ordering all of these components domestically, then ordering our 1 or 2 components from offshore, and then COVID hits, and we all of a sudden couldn't get these imported components in, right? And so we got hit with like the 4-month delays at LA port. We got hit with factory closures in China, all sorts of shipping and supply chain delays. Anyway, it was 2021 by the time we got all of our components in, right? And by this point, we'd already ordered and had delivered all of the seeds, which have expiry dates on them. So we had like this big aging inventory problem. We'd had actually a lot of missed sales opportunities because we were missing these components that we needed to finish off the kits. And so it wasn't until some point in 2021 where we actually had everything we needed. We were then able to assemble the complete kits. But by then, sales had slowed down. We had like $500,000 or $600,000 worth of aging inventory, and we spent basically the rest of 2021 and all of 2022 running a massive fire sale to try and get all of this inventory off our balance sheet. And we did it at the time knowing that we were absolutely destroying the P&L. Like, we went into it knowing that we were making a loss, but we did it and figured it was a smart thing to do because we needed to get this stuff off our balance sheet. Otherwise, it would have just been, getting written off. So we ended up running the business for about 2 years there at a pretty huge loss, just trying to get all of this excess inventory off. And yeah, I guess we can go on to start part 2 of that story. But just to give you a little bit of a preview, my 2023 began with a co-founder departure, 2 years of unprofitable business. It was like bleeding money, and also a massively over-leveraged balance sheet. And 2023 was not a good year of my life. But
for sure.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So I think it's funny because I was just thinking as you were talking through that, like lessons, like what did we learn, right? And from that experience.
Yeah.
There's a couple of the COVID stories I want to tell. I live one in particular that I've got to tell, but we'll talk about that later. Like lessons. I feel like during COVID, we're in the same situation as you, right? Lead times skyrocketed. We were basically out of stock for most of the year. As a delivery would come in, we just sell it immediately, right? Or a lot of it was, sometimes it was fully pre-sold. That for us, that did last all the way through the end of 2020. Like our Christmas was huge. We quadrupled top line revenue from 2019 to 2020. We could have 5 or 6x'd it, maybe even 7. I'm very certain if we had the inventory. And so coming out into 2021, you have the classic, like as they talk about in business school, the bullwhip effect. Like the bullwhip effect, meaning that like when there's a demand surge, it takes time to push all the way across the supply chain, and there's a delay, right, by many months or longer, and the time it takes for the far ends of the supply chain to react, by the time they react, the demand surge is gone, right? And so we saw that across the board in 2021, and for us, there was the compounding impact of not just demand increasing, but lead times in like going from 90 to 365 days. And so so literally, when did we place POs for 2021 demand? In March, in the first month of COVID.
Yeah.
We're placing POs for next year.
Yeah,
right?
no one had a clue what was going on.
No. And so in 2021, same thing for us. We still were we still grew year over year, but like 20 to 30%. Mind you, we're spending aggressively on paid advertising, right?
Yeah.
Like the whole time. But we went from like 300% year over year growth to 30, but we were forecasting another 200 to 300%. And so we went into, oh man, the conversations we had to have with factories about like, we can't pay you for that PO, stop making it. Let's work out a payment plan to just pay you back your cost over the next 6 months, letting people go. I mean, we went in 2020, we went from like 5 or 6 full-time people to like 30.
Wow.
In the middle of COVID. And then we went from having almost no inventory all year to having like over a year of inventory if you look at like days of cover.
Ouch.
And burning 6 figures a month on the P&L. And like luckily for us, we had a me being the CFO, and I'd love to hear your take on this with your company right after this, is like we had a financial model, so I could see we were going to run out of cash months before it happened. I was like, hey, we've got 9-10 months, right? Like it wasn't like we're going to die tomorrow. We still have time to turn this thing around. And so what we did is we really tried to retain as many people on staff as we could, because one thing that Guardian had proven during COVID is we did have product market fit, right? Like a bunch of demand from 2021 got pulled forward into 2020, but our value prop was working. People were willing to pay more for a bike. So it wasn't like we felt like our CEO and visionary Brian was very, very confident that like we still have a business here. We just got to out over our skis, right?
Yeah.
So we kind of divide and conquered. He's like, if I can go MIA from the day-to-day operations and I can go raise equity capital, and Jon, you run the day-to-day business and work on refinancing our debt stack. And so for all of 2021, that's what we did, is we worked with our suppliers. They were pissed, but it was happening across the board, and everyone got paid. No one didn't get paid. It was just like, we got to work together, right?
Yeah.
I know we told you to make this stuff, but stop making it. and we will work on how to pay you for the components. And I spent 6 months refinancing a $5 million loan. Brian went out and raised some equity capital, and by the end of 2021, we were recapped, had to let very few people go, and were well positioned for kind of like 2022 and beyond. But it was and Guardian is crushing it to this day, but that was a rough year, man.
It's scary,
That was a very rough year. It definitely took some, I've got some gray hair.
Are you dyeing them?
From that.
I can't even see your gray hairs.
Yeah.
You must be using Just for Men or something.
But yeah, I mean, and ultimately, like, I started Free to Grow CFO at the beginning of 2022. This is no one's fault at Guardian. I was just burned out. That was like going through 2020 on like the high of the highs, right? And getting a PhD in supply chain management and how stressful that was. And then working really hard to save the company in 2021 and recapitalize it. Took some years off my life, and I was like, I'm ready for the next thing after that.
Yeah. Ouch. Yeah, that sounds super stressful.
What about you guys? What are some of the things that you had to do in 2021 besides like the inventory liquidation?
Yeah, I got a couple of things to share. One is, I guess, the way we thought, or the way I'm thinking today about sourcing and assembly and procurement has definitely changed a lot. So, pre-COVID, we thought, my co-founder and I were both engineers, and if there's one thing you probably know about engineers is they love building shit. So, we thought we were pretty clever, like figuring out how to, assemble all these kits and, pull together all of these components. So a typical bomb for us might have between, I don't know, like 6 and 16 components, let's say, right? They're not super complicated products, but one thing that I came to learn some very, very hard lessons around is that when you're doing that and you're sourcing components from all of these different people, although yes, you might save a few bucks doing it that way, you bear the risk of everyone else's supply chain delays or screw ups. And in our case, like I said before, it just took one supplier unable to deliver one component and the whole system falls apart. So if you're doing, say, $200,000 production run and a component that's worth 10% of that, i.e. $20,000 is missing, you've now got $180,000 worth of inventory sitting on your balance sheet that you cannot move. And you've got to figure out how to finance it. And you're trying to figure out how to finance it at, a pretty less than ideal time. And that, caused us a huge amount of problems, because not only did we have to figure out how to finance all of this inventory that we couldn't move, but we also had this, sales and demand slowdown at the same time. So something I've done with Urban Leaf over the last year or two, and I'm still running it, by the way. I spend maybe 4 or 5 hours a week doing it. But one thing I've done over the last couple of years is basically push all of that risk back onto other people in the supply chain. So now really all I'm doing, the few products that we do handle of our own, is products that other people are basically white labeling for us. And so they're procuring all of the raw materials, they're managing the BOM, they're wearing the risk of, the stuff getting delivered or not. And so I don't take ownership of them until I know I've got a finished product and I'm going to be able to sell it immediately. And maybe it costs us a little bit more because we're not taking advantage of, a cheap supply here and then a cheap co-manufacturer there. But you know what? It is such an easier business to manage and operate that way. And there's such a big reduction in risk in terms of, when things go wrong, like they obviously did for a lot of us. The other thing that I learned a lot about, particularly in the aftermath of COVID, was debt and, the collateral and security of debt and how some of the fine print in these facilities works. So I was a customer of a company that you're probably aware of called Ampler. You might be aware that they've run into some issues of their own of late. But anyway, we had a facility with Ampler, and we're going into the end of 2022, and I needed some more cash, and they were our primary lender. And at the time, Ampler operated in a way where they basically didn't want you to take money from anyone else. Like they wanted to be your only source of debt. And I said to them, hey, I need more money because we got the Christmas holidays to get ready for, and I don't have like enough cash here to get the inventory that we need. And they said no. And they said, well, we look at 3 months trailing revenue, and we've kind of extended everything we can to you at this point. I'm like, yeah, but 3 months trailing is kind of summer, which is like the slowest time of year for a gardening period. Why can't we look forward into what I actually need rather than backwards? But anyway, after months and months of back and forth, I eventually got Ampler to lend us some more cash. But by the time they'd agreed to it, it was way later than I actually needed the cash. And so we're in a mad sprint to get everything done, doing all this kitting and manufacturing that I mentioned, trying to get all that ready for the end of 2022. And we were late with a lot of manufacturing, right? And we were at the time, selling a lot of stuff through Amazon, and, there was bottlenecks at the warehouses. It was taking months to get stuff checked in. Anyway, by the time we got all of our Christmas inventory, like much of the Christmas peak had kind of passed. So come the end of 2022, we had much slower sales than we'd expected. Ampler, I think leading into that, was taking maybe 8 or 10% of our revenue. But straight after Christmas, I was actually on vacation in Australia at the time. They said to me, hey, like your revenue's lower. We need to increase our revenue take rate from whatever it had been up to 40%. 40%.
Wow.
And I was like, excuse me, 40%? Like,
yeah,
I cannot operate this business if you're taking 40 cents on the dollar. And that would have forced us into bankruptcy like 2 weeks later had I, let it run its course. There's very, very few consumer products businesses that can survive from a cash flow perspective without 40% of their revenue. So I was like, are you guys mad? Like, are you trying to force us into bankruptcy here? Because it's like what you're going to do. And they were absolutely steadfast on it. So what I ended up having to do is basically disconnect Ampler from our bank. So I forced the company into a default situation so that we could maintain our cash. And then I basically forced Ampler into a situation where, we negotiated. What I didn't realize at the time, however, is that actually triggered a personal liability clause in the contract. So by defaulting on that payment mechanism, I became personally liable for the debt. I was like, oh, damn. So anyway, that was one of, many, many fun things that I had to deal with, and ultimately, figure out what to do with them.
Yeah, well, I mean, you mentioned one thing there that I want to highlight that was a big lesson in COVID. I've learned this elsewhere in my career as well, but it was definitely highlighted in COVID. Everything is negotiable. Like,
Yes.
and the reality is that, like, whether you're talking about lenders or you're talking about suppliers, like, you do need to have tough conversations sometimes. And, like, yeah, you can't make it a habit. It can't be your MO. If every time you place a PO with a vendor, you end up going too big and then you end up begging them to slow down or stop, then you're going to tarnish that relationship. But there are extenuating circumstances where you have to leverage your relationship, right?
Totally.
Leverage your relationship with a lender, leverage your relationship with your supply chain partners. We had to do a ton of that and ask them to do things that were very uncomfortable. But what was the focus on? The long term, right? It's like, hey, listen, the focus is on the long term. Everyone's going to ultimately get paid, right? But we're all in a bind together. And like, we need you to partner with us. So like, choosing your partners is really important. There were a lot of lenders who were not good partners during COVID, and there were a lot that were great. I have a very deep background in debt fundraising, and so I know a lot of the owners and C-suite guys at these different lenders, like, personally. And there were truly situations in COVID where like people, like brands were defaulting left and right or post-COVID, and they sat down and they truly worked with them. They put what's called a forbearance agreement in place, which is like, hey, you defaulted, but we're willing to not exercise these different rights we have upon default if you adhere to this and this and this. And there's usually a negotiation about, certain like paybacks or like payment schedules and things of that nature. But like choosing the right partner is really important. We place millions of dollars of POs with our factory in China, and we were pushing them for a year in 2020 to go faster, faster, faster. And then all of a sudden, in the beginning of 2021, we're like, stop. And they had already procured and paid for all these components, and they're like, well, what about us?
Yeah.
And so we had to come up with creative ways to work with them. Like, hey,
Yeah.
tell us how much you're out on cash for this order,
Yeah.
and let's see how we can pay you your cost. We can't do it all at once, but like I can pay you over the next whatever 6
Yeah.
weeks, 8 weeks, right? And just like really, that's part of business is you got to build a real relationship, and you've got to leverage it sometimes, right? And I think the other thing too, I would say my major takeaway on all of this, whether you're talking about the leveraging of relationships, negotiating, it's like focus on the long term, right? Because when we're in these micro, like short-term situations, it's easy to get so caught up in what's right in front of you. I mean, look, that's how we made a lot of mistakes on demand planning. We were like so focused on what was right in front of us. We put out these crazy demand and replenishment plans, right? Take a step back, focus on the long term. I actually post-COVID tell clients all the time, it's okay to stock out. I know it sucks. No one wants to stock out. And there's let's be honest with ourselves. What are like boom and bust cycles? Psychologically, they're created by two things: fear and greed. Fear and greed, fear and greed, fear and greed, right? And like the fear and the greed associated with like stocking out, leaving money on the table. Like, damn, like I could squeeze out that much more in sales. What does it really matter in the long term, right? If you take a step back and think about the long term, Guardian lived to fight another day, even though we stocked out. We stocked out left and right, and then we made the opposite mistake, which is holding way too much inventory. And in the long term, we're still building a brand that actually was going to grow over time and become super valuable. And like, it's easy to get caught up in the emotions of fear and greed when you're dealing with a demand spike or excess inventory, and you've just got to focus on the long term.
Yeah. No, I think you hit the nail on the head with all of that, especially the relationship stuff and, communicating with people, explaining what's going on. We had a number of situations where we're like, listen, I know I'm meant to pay you this amount on this day, but if I give that money to this guy instead, then I'm going to generate cash flow earlier, and that's going to be better for everyone. And what I want to do is try to keep the business alive here, because if it doesn't stay alive, then everyone loses, including you, and me. So, can we work together on this so that I can figure out a way to manage, the cash flow here to keep the whole ship afloat? Because if I can't keep the ship afloat, then, we're all going to drown. So absolutely kind of relies on relationships and communication. And to your point on, stocking out versus being overstocked, a couple of things there. It sucks as an entrepreneur to have a product, especially one where you've got product market fit, and not be able to sell it, right? But the public facing reality of that is that you've got a popular product and it's sold out. Sure. And it teaches the market that, this product is in high demand, and when it comes available again, you should pick it up fast because, people want it. The inverse is, if you ordered too much, is that the customer's less likely to see that. If they do see it, it will be in the form of a discount or a sale or promotion, and you don't really want to become known as a brand that's constantly discounting, because then people, lose credibility. But internally, what's going on with that company, as you and I know, is that there's probably dealing with a huge amount of stress with respect to financing that inventory and figuring out, how they're going to hold all of that inventory for long enough to be able to get it like off the balance sheet. Another thing I wanted to throw in here, a little, I don't know if you call it a hack or just a kind of view on the whole, FP&A thing as it comes to physical product businesses. But as you know, like most people, when they're doing their budgeting and planning, will look at like month on month, budget versus actual. And we'll do that like 1 month at a time generally. I'm of the view that that's a pretty silly way to do budget versus actual, because for physical products companies, it's very, very hard to have a meaningful impact on, the major line items in your P&L within the space of 30 days, right? Any major initiative, whether it's a cost-cutting initiative, a new marketing campaign, a change you're making to the website, whatever, like it's probably going to take a lot more than 30 days to play out. In addition to that, as I said earlier, like one of the good and bad things about entrepreneurs is that we tend to be very optimistic. Like we always want to think that the best possible outcome is going to be the one that transpires. And I recognize this in myself. And one of the things that I started doing as a way to kind of train myself or self-correct with over-optimism is basically building like forward curves of my, sales forecasts and demand forecasts.
Sure.
So you're familiar with the concept of a forward curve? Like you've probably seen
Yep.
it in commodity markets and stuff. But anyway, what that lets you to do is basically compare forecasts to forecasts rather than, forecast to actual, like over time. And so what you can see as you go through the year is like a whole lot of different lines which represent
For
your
sure.
demand or sales forecasts, at different points in time. And that's like a really, really helpful way to kind of train yourself on these intrinsic biases that you have and
Sure.
hopefully take them out of your work, as you become aware of them.
Yeah, I love that. I've done something similar in my sales forecasting, which is like, looking at the curve. I will compare it to historical data to see how much it differs from previous year's month-on-month forecasts to see like, am I departing from known seasonality trends? Am I
Yeah.
departing from am I going from like, hey, we've been growing this brand 30% year over year, and all of a sudden I'm saying we're growing it 95% year over year.
Yeah.
And the question I ask myself is like, is there a good reason why I'm forecasting that, right?
Yeah.
What is the driver of that?
Yeah.
Because sometimes, or actually what I've seen happen a lot of times in my own forecasts, is there's just some sort of like a mathematical multiplier effect of some way that I modeled something out that it's skewing the number. And like, I'm like, oh, well, that relationship worked in the past, so it should work now. And you absolutely need to take a step back and look visually at your forecast and compare it to different types of data, whether that's forecast on forecast or forecast on, previous year's data, to go, do I have a legitimate justification for why there's such a big variance between the two of these,
Totally. I was going to say a little tip or hack for founders of early stage brands where you don't have a big team. And I don't know about you, but I had a number of situations and experiences where like I was the CFO, I was the legal guy, I was the marketing department, I was the operations guy. And, these conversations about supply chain and decisions on demand planning are like going around in my own head. And often it's the founder and CEO who kind of wins out at that internal conversation because they're the optimist and they want to see, everything turn out fine and rosy. But something that really, really helps is if you can actually have a conversation with someone else who's really pessimistic and negative,
For sure.
and force yourself to justify these things to another human being who is smart enough to, pick up things like your 30 to 95% growth scenario, like what you just mentioned, like someone who can audit and interrogate your numbers and go, dude, what are you smoking? This makes no sense. Like, why would you do that?
Pull that off?
Yeah.
Well, and that's one way that like, and if you're not like a venture-backed brand, like venture-backed brands have a board. So a board can be super helpful, right? Because like they're more disconnected from the day-to-day. And so one of their jobs is to challenge the leadership team and go like, is this really the best thing for the business to do? If you're not a venture-backed brand, find a trusted mentor or mentors or like unofficial kind of advisor or advisors that you can go to and show them these things and ask for their take on it, because literally just a little bit of conversation can draw out the flawed logic pretty quickly, and where I find that's like a lot harder when I'm working with a brand that like has a very or I don't want to say predictable, because everyone's advertising kind of returns evolve over time. But when I have a brand that's spending heavily on paid media, like most of their revenue is coming from paid media, it's a lot easier to sanity check their sales projections because you have a relationship between advertising
True.
and revenue, right?
Mm-hmm.
But smaller brands that we work with that have not cracked the code on paid media, and a lot of their stuff is kind of like more organic, it's super hard to forecast revenue. Or I want to say it's, I don't want to say it's super hard. I want to say you're more susceptible. In my experience, you become even more susceptible to those like biases, those psychological biases, really screwing with the numbers because you don't have other data to look at, like what's your first order acquisition MER and AOV and CAC versus how frequently do people come back and repurchase things. When you have that kind of data, it doesn't guarantee you a accurate forecast, but you have more data to look to factually check the logic in your sales forecast. So that's another thing that I've noticed in my experience as well.
Totally, yeah. I guess with a product and brand like yours at Guardian, you had a differentiated product, you had a patent, you had a unique value proposition to the customer. I would just point out that when you're in a commodity marketplace, what you just described gets a whole lot harder because you run into this like game theory dilemma where, it's a lot harder to differentiate yourself from the competition. And as good a job as you might be doing and as sensible a player as you may be, you cannot discount the fact that there will be some other idiot in your marketplace who has got their own set of challenges and problems, who's got their own inventory situation, got their own cash flow problem, and they're just going to step into the market and go, you know what, I have to, do what I did for 2 years and like discount everything. Like I have to get rid of it. And they, people, particularly in marketplaces like Amazon, where everyone's chasing, vanity metrics like revenue, like people are going to undercut you and they're going to be focused on volume and price. And, as disciplined as you may be, sometimes you're going to end up losing.
For sure.
Yeah, that makes it a lot harder.
It's funny you mentioned that because the more and more that I do this Ecom thing and the more brands that we work with at Free to Grow CFO, right now we work with about 25 or so fast growing Ecom brands. What I'm seeing a lot of data points about like what withstands the test of time, what margin profiles withstand the test of time, what product categories, like what works and what doesn't work. And I'm starting to really realize like so here there's this double-edged sword with e-commerce, right? On the one hand, there's a low barrier to entry, so it's really easy to get started. That's that's like a pro. But the double-edged sword of that is anyone can start a brand selling the same thing as you, right? And even possibly worse. I don't know if this is good or bad, but like possibly worse, anyone in China or any other country can also start an e-com brand and start competing with you. And so what I found is that D2C scaling profitably and withstanding the test of time, it really relies on, even if the product you sell is commoditized, like in terms of like we have a clothing brand that we work with, that clothing is commoditized, but they have found this niche, right? They have found this niche market that they serve with a very specific type of clothing, and they're very good at the marketing and the whole unboxing experience. Going and competing against that is much harder than just competing against clothes in their category, right?
Totally, yeah.
And so what I've found about like most brands don't have what Guardian had, which is patented IP, right? But the ones who are crushing it, like we have some brands we're working with that are doing 50+ million a year in revenue. They're crushing it not because the category that they're in is like the category they're in is commoditized, but they have found this niche ICP that they serve, and they have found a niche way to serve them in a differentiated way, D2C, and that withstands the test of time. So it's not just about having a cool product. It, again, if you think about Guardian, we shifted to the channel of D2C because that was the channel we needed to sell our product, right? D2C is not the right channel for everybody. It's not just about a cool product, bring it to market on e-com sales channels. Is D2C the right strategic channel for the way that you are going to serve customers in a differentiated manner? And I think a lot of brand founders, unfortunately, they're really close to the customer, the problem they're solving. They're super passionate about the product, and like, I'm just gonna sell it D2C because it's easy to do, but only sell it on D2C if there's something unique about how that channel can serve your strategy, right? And so like, what that does is, if you think about things that strategically, it really starts whittling down, in my opinion, the number of products that can really crush it D2C and withstand the test of time without eventually going omni-channel or having some other advantage. But that's also why we don't just say eComm product. We don't just say D2C product. We always say D2C brand, because you're building a brand, and the brand needs to be as much, if not more, of your strategy than the product itself. You are building a brand, and if you're not building a brand, then like, it doesn't matter how slick the product is. Like, you're eventually, it is going to be a race to the bottom eventually. So
100%.
So look, I want us to end here. I don't know. I'm pulling this kind of out of nowhere. I didn't warn Nate about this. So Nate, if you can't think of one, I'm sorry, but I want to end with a funny story. And so I have a funny COVID story that I want to tell. If you can think of one, I'll give you a second while I'm telling mine. But this is the story of, this was like a fable in what is a true story, but it was like folklore at Guardian Bikes. It's the fabled COVID Santa story. So I'm going to tell this story. This one is funny. This was classic. Okay, so 2020, it's October. We are coming up on the deadline of like knowing what our supply is going to be for the holidays, because we're reaching the cutoff of like what we know is likely going to make it through the ports and make it to our 3PL in time for holidays. So like those couple of weeks leading up to that cutoff, we're just every single day, I mean multiple times a day, me, CEO, supply chain, and operations team, all we're talking about is, where are these deliveries, how many units are in them, what are the transportation methods. And so we're a week out from like the cutoff of cutoffs, right? And we realize we're going to have a bunch of product that actually makes it through the port, but is going to miss trucks on the way to our 3PL. And so we start having these meetings going like, what are some creative ways that we could possibly get this product to our 3PL? Because our 3PL is telling us, even though volume is crazy, they're still going to be able to check them in, but we've got to get it there. And so we come up with this idea of like, we're going to rent U-Haul and budget trucks, right? And like, people from the company, CEO, me, the CEO's co-founder, like whoever can go is going to like fly to California to the port of LA. We're going to rent as many U-Haul and budget trucks as we can. We're going to unload these containers, and we're going to fill up these rented trucks, and we're going to drive to Salt Lake City and Knoxville, Tennessee, where our warehouses are, and we're going to deliver these bikes ourselves. So like, no joke, I'm with my FP&A team and my logistics team, and we are like crunching all these numbers to see like, what's it going to cost? Can we still turn a profit? I mean, we spent like every single day for a week on this, and we ended up coining the project COVID Santa, because like, as we were like getting more and more into it, I started realizing the comedy in the fact that like we're legitimately talking about flying people in this remote company that we're distributed all around the country to California to rent trucks and drive stuff ourselves. I go, guys, we have got to all dress in Santa costumes, and we've got to document it on our phones, and it's got to make its way to social media. It's got to be a bunch of like COVID Santas driving these like U-Haul trucks like full of Guardian bikes, trying to get it to the warehouse. And we ended up, it sucks, we ended up not doing it because those bikes ended up not as many bikes came available as we thought at the port. And we weren't the only ones that had this idea, because U-Haul and budget trucks were completely sold out. Plus, people were moving all around the country, so they were just like sold out. Couldn't even get them if we wanted to, and if you could get one, they were crazy expensive. But for like a couple of weeks, we were just laughing. We were just telling jokes in all these meetings about like Brian, our CEO, just like with his phone on Instagram, like dressed as Santa, like driving this budget truck of bikes to get to the 3PL. COVID Santa, baby.
Awesome. Well, it's going to be a hard one to top, but Well, let me think. I guess my best COVID-ish related story is I'm not sure if you're aware, but I actually was doing the van life thing for most of COVID. So I was
Oh
like,
wow.
well, I don't need to be in New York, New York. I've got a fully online business. So I was like touring around the country in my Sprinter van, working remote. Anyway, I was one day I was driving through California. I was off grid and couldn't pull up Google Maps and drove past this area. It was like a big open, wide open area. There was no one around. I thought, like, screw it, that seems like a good place to camp. So I drove down this dirt road for 5 or 10 minutes, found this little pond and a tree. It was quite pretty, and parked up, went to bed, had a lovely night's sleep. Anyway, get up in the morning, I open up the van door, pull out my computer, log in, and I'm sitting down to do some work. And this cop car comes around the pond. I'm like, oh shit, like, what's going on here? Anyway, I started the conversation with the cops, and they're like, what the hell are you doing here, man? Like, this is a military base. You're not meant to be here. I'm like,
Oh man,
oh,
that is great.
oh, damn, okay. I'm like, well, what are you doing here anyway? I'm like, well, I'm working. What do you mean you're working? I'm working on my e-commerce business. And they're like, what the hell are you doing running an e-commerce business from here? Well, I sell gardening products on the internet. And this cop was like, oh, what sort of gardening products? Well, like hydroponics and grow lights and this, that, and everything. Oh, really? I've been wanting to grow weed at home. Like, do you know anything about that? I noticed you got some solar panels on your van. Like, do you reckon I'd be able to you could show me how to set up a solar powered hydroponic weed set up at home?
That
So
is
there
so
I
good.
was on a military base having a conversation with a Californian cop about how to grow weed hydroponically.
Oh, dude, that's a great story. That is
Yeah.
such a great story, man. I'm surprised that you made it through the night without them bugging you. I've accidentally parked. My car broke down on the other side of the fence of a military base, and I had
Mm.
military police on me in about 30 seconds. So,
Ooh.
yeah, that's a great story.
Yeah.
Well, so unfortunately, we got to land the plane on this one, but this episode was better than I thought it was gonna be. I love this.
Good.
Thank you for suggesting this.
Of
With
course.
no script before this, people. This is just John and Nate riffing
Just
on
riffing,
crazy
chatting.
war stories. Before we do land the plane, though, where can people find a little bit more information about you and about Future Ready?
Yeah, for sure. I am most active on LinkedIn, so if you want to hook up with me there, it's Nate Littlewood. The website is getfutureready.co. Pretty simple website at this stage, but there's a couple of things on there. But yeah, probably the best place to get me is on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on there, so. Yeah, but this
Yeah.
has been great, John. I always enjoy chatting with you, and been fun to compare war stories here. So thanks for the opportunity, and I look forward to keeping in touch.
Yep, absolutely, man. This was a great conversation. Definitely check out Nate's content. He's putting some great stuff out on LinkedIn. And if you're looking for some other fresh, helpful tips on scaling a profit-focused D2C brand, consider following me, Jon Blair, on LinkedIn. And if you're interested in learning more about how free-to-grow CFOs, D2C accountants, and fractional CFOs can help your brand increase profit and cash flow as you scale, check us out at freetogrowcfo.com. And until next time, scale on.